Well, welcome. My name is Jeff Polet. I direct the Ford Leadership Forum at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, and I'll be chairing the panel today and then um, uh, acting as a discussant after the presentations. This panel focuses on the 2024 U.S. presidential election and some of the key issues that arose before and after Election Day. With high stakes, the election practitioner community expressed concern over potential fraud allegations and even the risk of electoral violence. Although the most serious fears do not materialize, this electoral event offers a valuable opportunity to analyze how election officials, civil society initiatives, and political actors prepared for and promoted electoral integrity. The panel will review the Carter Center's first domestic observation mission during a U.S. election, communication strategies used by election officials, and legal strategies related to electoral litigation. We have three panelists on this panel, all of whom are experts on election integrity and voter education. So I'm going to introduce each panelist as they come up. So I'm going to do the first panelist. After she's done, I'll introduce the second panelist and so forth. So our first panelist is Sarah Cooper, who serves as Associate Director of Democracy, principally supporting the Carter Center's US-based democracy programming. She has more than 15 years of experience in the international democracy and governance space, including a wide variety of field and headquarters-based roles at the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. As a global elections expert, Sarah Cooper has supported nonpartisan, citizen-led election observation work, including parallel vote tabulations and electoral violence early warning efforts in more than 20 countries. In the United States, she has provided high-level technical support to both the Montana Election Observation Initiative and Observe New Mexico elections networks. With that, I will turn it over to Sarah.
So much, Jeff, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I appreciate everyone's patience. I'm not the most tech-savvy person in the world, but we do have a little bit of a PowerPoint presentation for you all. So I'll be talking about nonpartisan election observation in the United States and how we sought to build trust through transparency in the 2024 election. As I think most of the folks who are here probably know, the Carter Center has been a global leader in the space to strengthen democracy internationally for decades. It's recognized as one of the world's leading expert organizations in the field of international election observation. What people maybe don't remember is that the very first international election observation mission fielded by the National Endowment for Democracy in Panama in 1989 was actually co-chaired by former presidents Carter and Ford. And so it feels especially fitting and like a kind of lovely full circle moment to be here with Jeff Polet today, talking about how we've continued to carry out that legacy. The Carter Center was very much focused internationally on doing that work up until 2020. At that point in time, the Carter Center made an intentional decision concerned about rising political polarization on both sides, concerned about localized potential for election violence, concerned about potential for non-acceptance of election results, to do work in the United States and to try to translate some of that international best practice to our context here at home. So for the past year, I've been working with the Carter Center in the Associate Director position to launch nonpartisan, citizen-led election observer missions, very much the way that this is practiced in most electoral democracies around the world, but it's a new practice here in the United States. And so we've got some lessons learned and some challenges that I'll be happy to share. To provide a little bit of background, why did we think that nonpartisan election observation would be the right kind of approach to meet the moment here in the United States? We expected it to increase trust and transparency in elections. Elections are certainly not unique in this respect. Trust in institutions is declining. across the board in the United States. Elections are foundational to that trust in additional democratic institutions. If you don't trust the process by which your elected officials have been elected, you're not likely to trust the institutions that they come into power to lead. So rebuilding trust in elections we saw as a very foundational activity. And we believe that having greater transparency and greater independent oversight was likely to help with rebuilding trust. And there's a bit of data and evidence that backs this up. For example, the Survey on the Performance of American Elections, which is administered to over 10,000 voters across the country, included a new question in 2022. 61% of citizens said that they would have more confidence in the security and integrity of their election processes in the US if they knew that there had been independent poll watchers who had been present. There's also research that came out earlier this year, last year, on citizen observation and whether it could increase public confidence in US elections, that drew in part on work that the Carter Center had piloted in Fulton County in 2022. And found increases in confidence. We've also learned about some forthcoming research led by Lana Ray Atkinson and Wendy Hassan, who sought to assess some of our work in New Mexico. And they also found statistically significant, although small, increases in voter confidence as a result of having observers present. Nonpartisan election observation speaks to the process of the election in a holistic manner, not the outcome. It seeks to assess very systematically whether the process was competitive, transparent, accountable, inclusive, using structured forms that allow for aggregated findings. This allows for there to be data and evidence that can support electoral reforms where warranted. We thought that was very important. The discussion around electoral reform in the US has become quite politicized. We wanted to pivot it back to data. And it also provides a really needed third voice in the United States, where otherwise discourse around elections tends to be dominated by political parties who have their own incentives to praise the process when they perform well, disparage the process when they don't perform well, and media, which tends to focus on the most sensational parts of an election. And that's true all across the world. That's what drives clicks, that's what drives viewers. So we thought it was very important to have these be citizen-led efforts. We know even though there's declining trust in institutions, that people do generally still trust their neighbors. And we were able to successfully launch 3 pilot programs in 3 states. We had a very comprehensive statewide observation effort in the state of New Mexico, recruiting New Mexicans to observe New Mexico elections on behalf of New Mexicans. In the state of Montana, similarly, statewide effort where local Montanans were recruited and trained to observe the Montana elections on behalf of Montanans. And we also had a more targeted effort in Fulton County, Georgia, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. The Carter Center was invited in as part of an expert monitoring team on behalf of the Fulton County Board of Elections. And so we were able in total to mobilize, to train more than 500 observers, mobilize approximately 400 observers across those 3 states, and produce very comprehensive final reports about how the elections proceeded. The idea here as well is that these observers then became trusted messengers back to their communities. They understood the election process. They could go back to their neighbors on a very local level and talk about how the process went. And I'll stop sharing and switch to a video just to let you hear a little bit more about that effort from the observers in their own words. Everyone able to see this screen? Okay, from Jeff.
In elections around the world, there's partisan observers. So people who work with political parties. Carter Center conducts what we call nonpartisan observation. We have no political interests in mind, but we're there to provide an extra set of eyes, an extra set of analysis and reporting on what happens throughout the electoral process.
Since 1989, the Carter Center has observed more than 125 elections in 40 countries. In 2024, it conducted nonpartisan election observation in Fulton County, Georgia, and supported similar efforts in New Mexico and Montana.
Our theory is that as people understand what it takes to put elections on and really understand the minutia of the process, that that level of transparency will increase people's trust in elections.
It allows individuals to see behind the scenes of what's actually going on in their communities, especially in a time in our country right now when so many people feel so distrustful.
The Carter Center provided training, technical know-how, and funding to nonpartisan organizations in New Mexico and Montana, making it possible for them to deploy more than 300 people across their states to observe everything from early voting to ballot counting, from machine testing to post-election audits.
I have to say that what's really struck me is how competent, well-organized, and how focused on processes the two sites that I've observed are.
The systems that they have in place just boggle the mind. I really feel like I don't see how you could have a fraudulent election.
While nonpartisan election observation is common around the world, only about half of U.S. states allow it.
In the United States, it's a very foreign thing, but the people who worked on these projects in New Mexico and Montana and Georgia immediately saw the value and the possible contributions that can come from this kind of work.
People's faces light up and they realize they have a role. They actually get to be part of this process and bring back to their families, their communities, what they saw. And that's democracy right there.
In all three states, the organizations released reports detailing what went well and what needed improvement. And though the 2024 election largely lacked the unsubstantiated allegations of fraud made in 2020 and 2022, Carol believes that in our polarized environment, the work was and will remain critical.
I didn't anticipate that we would be in this kind of environment in 2024 and looking ahead to 2025, but it makes me feel that this work is more important than ever, and that we're well placed to try to keep it moving.
All right. So I think our observers were able to do a really good job of explaining for themselves what some of the benefit of this work was. I will say we were standing on the shoulders of giants in launching this effort in the United States. This is a very new practice here, but we were able to benefit from the global community of practice around nonpartisan election observation, good practices coming from the global network of domestic election monitors, the whole legacy going all the way back to NAMFREL's organization in the Philippines. As we launch some of these practices in the United States. A few other outcomes that are worth touching upon. First, I think it's very notable that we were able to mobilize locally recruited observers to watch the processes in their own communities, both in the areas that were very urban and in contexts that were very rural. And there's a nice photo here actually of one of our coordinators for Observe New Mexico elections, recruiting folks at Laguna Pueblo in New Mexico. So they really pounded the pavement. We had a large percentage of observers in New Mexico who came from the Navajo Nation in McKinley County. We were able to benefit from a partnership with the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission, which really facilitated recruitment there. These were really very process-focused efforts that were statewide and genuine kind of grassroots observer networks that came together in less than a year, which is quite exciting. One of the things that we were mindful of as we launched this work in the United States is that we didn't want it to be perceived as a partisan effort, particularly with President Carter having been a Democratic president in the United States. So one thing that was very critical to this approach, we put together cross-partisan advisory boards in each state. They advised on the overall approach. They served as the organizational spokespeople. These were individuals who came from either prominent civic organizations, former elected officials, former election officials, who had a real platform in the state and were able to help amplify the findings. We got good pickup by media in major papers and local news stations in all three states. One thing that was especially effective in Montana, we actually launched the program during the primaries in September. We had a more targeted effort focused on Missoula County. Being able to spread the word about nonpartisan observation at a time when the media environment was a little bit saturated actually made the Montana Election Observation Initiative the major reference point in the state for assessing the quality of the November November elections. And so by the time November came around, media was proactively reaching out to the observer group and asking for their comment, which was quite exciting. And the thing that's most impactful, I think, for me personally, there was a really long-lasting impact we heard on the individuals who took part. We asked the observers to self-assess as part of their observation checklists, whether they felt they knew more about the election process as a result of having observed. The overwhelming majority across all 3 states reported that they did. We also heard in post-election debriefs things about how observers felt more empowered to take part in town hall meetings, that they continued to meet to learn about elections and talk to one another after the project was over. And so I do think it had a really transformative power that will hopefully keep folks engaged in democracy even after these efforts have ended and between election cycles. We had a full cycle election observation approach that was really important here in the US. One thing that's a little bit of a difference from when the Carter Center observes internationally, the United States relies very heavily in many states on what can be considered special voting arrangements. So things like early voting, voting by mail. It's not just one day where you have to focus the entire effort. So I'm not going to dig into these statistics too much, but we did try to make sure we had observers present all throughout the process, starting with the testing of election equipment, looking at things like poll worker training, ballot pre-processing, through early voting and election day, looking at tabulation, post-election audits, certification of results. These were very comprehensive observation efforts in all 3 of the jurisdictions where we observed. A few of the challenges, I just touched on one, is the full cycle approach and widespread use of special voting arrangements. The United States is also extremely decentralized. There are more than 9,000 unique election jurisdictions. I pulled this map here, which actually doesn't even show all 9,000 of the electoral jurisdictions. This is just rolling things up at the county level from verified voting. But counties really have a lot of latitude, and in some instances, even municipalities and townships in the United States to run elections according to their own process within the bounds of state and national law. So this meant we had to have very localized relationships with election administrators and a very localized understanding of elections in a way that you might not when there's a centralized election management body. We also had to overcome concerns from election administrators that observers that they were more familiar with in the past had been partisan observers conducting gotcha exercises. And so again, that meant we had to cultivate very clear relationships with election administrators. And we had to take care to operate in states where there were obvious legal openings for and past precedent of independent observation. And that influenced the choice to be in New Mexico and Montana. To close, I'll just share a couple of quotes from 2 of our observers, which I think, again, really encapsulate how powerful this was for the folks doing this for the first time. I love this quote from Pamela Sear, so I'll just read that out. There's also a nice one from Christy Ortiz. Pamela in Montana says, "Observing firsthand, I was struck by the immense dedication, volunteering, and hard work required to make Election Day a success. It was truly enlightening. I saw young people voting for the first time, thrilled by the opportunity. New American citizens also voting for the first time, excited to take part in the democratic process. Watching the voters, election judges, and other poll watchers throughout the day, I saw people genuinely happy to be there. There were smiles, kindness, and a real sense of community. I couldn't help but wonder where all the angry, fearful, and divisive voices from social media were. In person, these people just looked like my neighbors. Because of my experience yesterday, today I feel hopeful. A neighbor posted this morning about the importance of volunteering, so I want to challenge all my friends and neighbors to get involved." We were able to produce very comprehensive final reports coming out of all 3 processes, or 4 efforts rather. We had a targeted effort looking at the risk-limited audit in Georgia as well. Overall, these reports validated across a very, very broad swath of metrics that the elections were being well conducted in accordance with state and local legal procedures. an established precedent. We did have some findings for recommendations for improvement. For example, in New Mexico, the same-day voter registration system experienced some challenges across the state. We were able to recommend some additional stress testing. I would encourage all of you to check out these reports. We'd be happy to make the links available after the presentation. And thank you. I'll pause there.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. It's terrific work you and your team have been doing. I've been fortunate now to have worked with Sarah on election integrity things over the last couple of years, and I've learned so much from her and the work that she and her team do. So great stuff. Thank you. Our next speaker is Leah Maravaki. Dr. Maravaki is an associate teaching professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy and an associate research professor at the Massive Data Institute at Georgetown University. Leah's research interests lie in the intersection of election science, voter behavior, and political communication. She is working with academics, federal and state agencies, election officials, and pro-democracy stakeholders to understand how accurate and false information flows in the election information ecosystem and how trust-building communication campaigns can help build trust in the integrity of elections. Since 2020, Leah has been co-directing the Election Officials Communications Tracker, a massive data collection and analysis initiative that tracks all state and election officials' communication efforts on social media. This work has received funding by the MIT Election Data Science Lab and Public Agenda. She is author of the book, The Administration of Voter Registration, Patterns and Variation Across and Within the American States, and is published in a wide range of peer-reviewed journals. Some of her most significant research involves voter education. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Maravaki.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for this introduction. It's great to be here. I will also note that I'm also a member of the U.S. election team at the Carter Center since 2020. I'm very proud for this collaboration. Hi, everyone. I would like to get my presentation started with a quote that serves as the inspiration for this research on voter communications around election security specifically, and a shout out to New Mexico in transition to Sarah's presentation. This is one example among many that illustrates election officials' communications on social media, what they talk about, how they talk about it, and I thought this was a nice way to explain something very complex, meaning how voters are tabulated, how they're cast, and how to reassure voters that their vote is going to be counted. So here, the Secretary of State of New Mexico responds to a voter who posted something on X about how do I know that my vote is counted, saying if you heard a ding, then and you saw the ballot cast number increased by 1, then your vote was counted. So the underlying theme here is how to communicate to voters about election security, but also about the process of voting and counting votes. So for many of us who study elections in the United States, and for those who observe elections in the United States, the landscape has significantly changed in the last federal cycles. We have observed partisan gaps in voter confidence that someone votes counted as intended, votes in someone's state, votes in other states, and votes nationally. We have observed persistent election denial, particularly from the right, which seems to magically have disappeared after the 2024 cycle. Persistent disinformation about election integrity specifically, that processes are not secure, that voting methods are not secure, that the people running elections have partisan motives and they're not professionals, and increased scrutiny among the public and bad faith actors, but also harassment toward election officials and workers. So the landscape is very intense and has put a strain in the election infrastructure. At the same time, however, we have more and more evidence that recent elections have been the most secure in U.S. history. We have the CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, putting out reports after the 2020 election and after 2024, affirming that our elections were secure, the infrastructure was resilient, election officials were resilient. So there's no evidence to suggest or to give truth to claims and concerns that our process is not secure and that the election outcomes are not to be trusted. At the same time, there has been more and more evidence to show that states have been adopting and have been following protocols very consistently relating to election security, which speaks more to the robustness of the whole infrastructure, even though it is very decentralized. So a big question that I'm asking in my research, and many of us are asking, is why are we observing such a lack of confidence? And why are we observing such discrepancy among the electorate expressing low confidence that the election process in the United States is not secure? And how do we explain this significant change after the 2024 election? This gap really narrowed, and there are some patterns of reversal among the left expressing concerns about the integrity of the 2024 election. Of course, there are some factors that explain why this is the case, why the public acts the way it does, especially around elections, and it acts the way it does before and after the election process. Misinformation and disinformation is a big factor, casting doubt on how election procedures are run and how things are done in the context of elections. Voters feel very strongly about who they want to win, and they are bitter when their candidate loses, or they're excited when their candidate wins. So that also explains why we see those transitions immediately before and after an election with respect to confidence that votes are counted accurately. But another aspect of this, another factor, is a significant lack of familiarity with how elections work. Voters are not election officials. They don't run elections. There's so much complexity that voters are not exposed to. So it is not surprising when they hear something about X states, there was a lag in the system, or there were non-citizens or citizens were found to be double voting or double registered. It's reasonable to raise some concerns when voters are not familiar with all these protocols. And at the same time, there are a lot of concerns among voters as to who are those people that run elections in the United States, given that many among state and local election officials are run and are elected in partisan elections. So conflict of interest. How can they run elections in a non-partisan manner when they themselves are candidates running for a partisan office? In the response from the election community, particularly as a reaction to rising disinformation and election denial, has been let's build robust communication infrastructures. So let's communicate more clearly and more consistently about what we do and how we do it to secure the election process. And this is part of the research that I have been doing for the last 4 or 5 years, understanding how election officials communicate and how they build strategies around election security, broadly and specifically process-based and people-based, to build trust among the public that those who run elections are professionals, but also election processes are secure. And this is why voters should trust the election results. Election officials have a very hard job, as we all know and understand. It is very complicated and complex to explain those processes in layman's terms. They don't have time, they don't have resources. So it is a big challenge to translate all this complexity into layman's terms for the public to understand and follow. Also, there are many ways to educate voters, and we study a lot of what's happening online because that's where people congregate in digital spaces, and that's how they get information. But there are other ways that voters are exposed to and engage with one another offline as well. So it is very complicated and increasingly burdensome to construct strategies to educate voters in all these spaces and find voters where they are, because election officials are many of them are not in those spaces where voters congregate. And allocating time and resources between doing the work, because it is more complex and it is something that includes the whole election cycle. It's not only 3 months, it's ongoing. So spending time educating voters, but also doing the work, is very, very complicated. And of course, they do this work facing high scrutiny from the public. So there are a lot of challenges for election officials to actually do this work and to communicate with voters. Okay. So lessons from the 2022 midterm elections. This is the first election cycle where my team and I were able to comprehensively study voter communications across the states at the state and local level. We found positive impacts with respect to those voter communications, particularly around trust. Voters learn how to complete processes. They're more likely to successfully register to vote, to successfully request and submit a mail ballot that will count, but also more likely to express confidence that votes in their county, in their state, that were counted as valid, and also among those voters who are more prone to skepticism. So we found the relationship between voter communication efforts, robust communication efforts, and active efforts, and those outcomes. And what seemed to have worked is that investment, both monetary and human resource allocation on trust building, rapid response misinformation efforts, and states have been very, very good in doing that and building that infrastructure, being consistent in communicating online and offline, and buy-in from state and local election officials and other stakeholders like federal agencies, law enforcement officers, civil society. So in other words, that's a community response to build trust in the election process. What didn't seem to work as well, at least in 2022, was relying on hashtag campaigns, so at least on social media, because it's easy. Those campaigns that rely solely on those signals did not seem to work very well for voters. Lack of substance as to how and why exactly election processes are secure seem to be doing better compared to just saying, trust us, we're the experts, and whatever we say, you should take our word for it. So in other words, strategy is more nuanced, it requires more detail, and voters respond better to those details so that they can connect the dots. Why is this process being implemented, and how exactly does it secure my vote? So in 2024, we replicated our research on communication strategies among state and local election officials. And my team and I have built this project that we call the Election Officials Communications Tracker, where we monitor and analyze organic social media communications, meaning not paid advertising, in the 3 months where the most heightened activity takes place in the election cycle, from poll worker recruitment to post-election processes. We have collected about 60,000 posts that were shared by about 1,600 state and local election official accounts across different platforms. Those mainstream platforms, I guess, is what we describe them. And we try to capture efforts to recruit poll workers starting from August 28th and up to certification at the state and local level. To understand all this content, we have come up with a hierarchical taxonomy of labels. Basically, we content analyze all these posts and we assign labels, whether one post talks about voter registration or it talks about mail voting, whether it talks about outreach to local communities, partnerships, hashtag campaigns. It is very comprehensive and sophisticated, and we turn to thematically organize those communications. For some context, social media is a good way to understand that landscape because we can collect this data and we can make sense of it across the board. As we know, we have a highly decentralized structure of election administration in the United States. Duties are sometimes shared and often shared among different entities. We have the state secretary of state or the election director at the state level. We have local election officials, and all of these people are tasked with also communicating to the public. But not everyone is present on social media. Of course, that doesn't mean they don't communicate offline, but social media is a good way to understand this landscape. At the state level, most election offices are present on mainstream platforms, not on those where the youth congregate as much, but Facebook and X are the major ones. Among local election officials, this is where we identify the most disparities, and that's a function of capacity. There are many factors to explain that. It's not lack of willingness, it's more complicated than that. But what this means is that in those spaces, many local election officials are not there. And so that indirectly means that voters cannot get access to that information because of lack of presence. And that is what it looks like if we actually want to map it out. And as Sarah mentioned in her presentation, this map does not even capture the hyper-local election administration, the municipality and city. Getting access to this data is very complicated. But the gist of it is that social media presence among local election officials is very spotty. And again, does not mean that they don't do voter education and they don't communicate. But given that the majority of voters are active and share and engage with information on social media, this is a missed opportunity. This is a gap that we identify. Now, in the 2024 cycle, there was a clear shift in how election officials communicated to voters compared to 2022 about election security. They focused on a lot of the term safeguards, communicating more explicitly about what it takes to secure the vote. And we identified two major themes. One is process-based, explaining how procedures are run, including voting technology, and how those procedures secure the vote. Again, connecting the dots a little bit more clearly, but also people-based, messages about who is engaged in the election process and how exactly they do that, in what manner. And a huge emphasis on professionalism and bipartisanship. Top-line findings from our work in 2024, we found communications as storytelling, describing to voters that there's a whole procedure, there are procedures that involve the whole election process from start to finish, that there are processes that election officials follow during the whole election cycle that doesn't necessarily have to do with casting a vote, but that they're crucial to ensure that to ensure electoral integrity, such as voter list maintenance, removal of debt or ineligible voters, verifying citizenship, doing cybersecurity trainings of election officials and poll workers, pre-election activities like recruitment and training, logic and accuracy testing, public observation, partisan observation, ballot proofing, ballot processing checks, informing voters about how to be election ready, but also explaining why, making sure that someone's registration is up to date and updating their signature, why is that important, and how it factors in verifying mail ballots, for example. So all of those communications that are and processes are happening, are ongoing and are happening at different stages in the election process. And of course, and not surprisingly, post-election procedures like canvassing, tabulation, reporting unofficial results, and the difference between unofficial and official, audits and recounts, and certification. What this means in terms of how much volume is being of content is communicated to voters, those process and people communication space about election security and trust building communications take a small fraction of what is happening overall in the information landscape in terms of what is coming out from these state election offices, and that seems to be very low. But at the same time, election officials are very active in communicating to voters about when deadlines are, when to register to vote, and how to do so, how to participate as a poll worker, how to request and mail back your ballot, on what to do when there's an emergency, like in North Carolina or Georgia. So there are all of these topics that election officials communicate about, and election security is one of them. And it's not surprising that we see a spike closer to election day and after election day, because this is when most of the post-election activities are taking place, but also that's when we know who most likely won the election, and voters are very, very attentive and feeling that satisfaction that who they voted for, that's the person who won, and expressing that confidence, but and vice versa, the skepticism if their preferred candidate lost. So I want to spend a little bit more time talking about the people running elections, because we identified very consistent and specific terminology and themes in how those processes were communicated, that people are trained, they're professional, they're part of your community, they are your friends and neighbors, but very, very importantly, they work in a bipartisan manner. There are bipartisan checks and balances among election officials, but also temporary workers who observe and safeguard this process. And this was communicated very, very consistently from poll workers, from county party chairs, from election officials themselves, and all of those bipartisan checks and balances being embedded in multiple procedures across the states. Because observation was to be mentioned and was discussed today, I also want to showcase that that's another example of how election officials were communicating that elections are transparent and trustworthy, the observation in the process, and the public being welcome to attend and participate in those procedures like logic and accuracy testing. So that was another example of election officials communicating that this is why our systems are secure, but also we welcome the public to participate and observe firsthand, to have that experience about how we do the work that we do. Another spotlight I would like to show some examples of how different election offices have approached those communications. So some strategies. So one example is the New York State Board of Elections. They did a series of thematic content, 12 days of election security. They addressed them as, and they talked about post-election audits, being prepared, having an emergency plan, having procedures to verify signatures, debunking myths about machines being connected to the internet, or votes not being private when they're cast, oversight, equipment testing, voter list maintenance. So all of those procedures being consistently communicated to voters to reassure them. And of course, the timing is very important because that's the time when votes are counted and the state is gearing up for certification. Another example is the different tactics, I guess, or tools election offices have been using to share that information, infographics or videos. But those examples here from local and state officials are useful to from Cuyahoga County communicating exactly the different aspects of the election process. So on the left-hand side is all the measures from voter ID to misinformation and disinformation combating efforts. And on the right-hand side is the standards of conduct of elections. And a lot of states have taken that approach to communicate our principles, right? So what guides our approach to running elections, and that we are professionals, we have integrity, we are honest with each other, we have teamwork, and we're trustworthy, as extra efforts to communicate that to voters and build that trust, not only the election process, but also in the people who run the elections. Another example that was very relevant to 2024 about citizenship and reinforcing to voters that we have those procedures in place and we only allow citizens to vote. And some election officials were more, I guess, they took different approaches to convey that to voters. The Indiana Secretary of State was very active on the left-hand side, going out and having those signs, only U.S. Citizens can vote. On the right-hand side, the Wyoming Secretary of State's office put a statement out during National Voter Registration Week, claiming that this is national, only citizens can vote week, and put out a press statement to tell voters that in our state, only citizens vote, and we're very vigilant. And those are, in the context of what is happening, they can be perceived as a little bit polarizing, but at the same time, there are efforts by state election officials to build trust among voters that in our state, non-citizens are not allowed to vote, and this is why. The big picture here is there's a lot of effort, there are a lot of resources. Does this help? How does it affect the election information ecosystem and voters? Are voters listening, and will they keep listening and what are the challenges in facilitating that listening to election officials? We have evidence from our research that high voter education activity, being present online and offline, and being active and investing resources in voter education works. It has educative effects and also helps build trust and voter confidence in election outcomes. At the same time, we also have evidence that this works if election officials have the resources they need, and those resources are consistent. And we know this is a major problem moving forward. We also know that with the landscape, what's happening now with federal agencies funding being cut. We also know voter education is the first to be cut from state and local funding. We anticipate higher polarization and skepticism about integrity will increase as a result of the context, the electoral context and the political context, but also lack of funding. And the high fragmentation of the information environment, meaning voters get information from different spaces. The quality of that information is very questionable. It makes it more difficult for voters to determine what is real and what isn't. It makes it more difficult for them to identify who are the trusted messengers. And it also makes it difficult for election officials to navigate that information disorder, due to lack of resources, but also to lack of expertise to navigate all these spaces and be present in all those spaces. So I will stop there. I have more, but I will save it for Q&A. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Leah. That was great. I'm sure we'll have some good questions about that afterward. Our final speaker is Chad Vickery, who is Vice President of Global Strategy and Technical Leadership at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, where he oversees global efforts to strengthen democratic resilience through legal reform, electoral integrity, and institutional innovation. He has advised governments and election commissions in more than 30 countries on election dispute resolution and comparative legal frameworks. Chad has authored several publications on standards applicable to electoral dispute resolution, serves as acting director of IFES's Center for Anti-Corruption and Democratic Trust, and is a member of the American Bar Association's Standing Committee on Election Law. He holds a JD from Catholic University. So we have that in common. Well, I don't have a JD from Catholic University, but I have my PhD from there. An MA in International Relations from Georgetown University, and a BA in International Political Economy from the University of Washington. Chad, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Jeff. First, I just want to say thank you to the Carter Center and the Election Integrity Project for holding this event. I think it's such an important time to do so. I also just want to say that it was Leah's presentation on confidence and the lack of trust in the system is something that I will touch on as well. And then finally, I think it was really interesting, Sarah's quote about a person who came to the polling center and said, you know, where's all the anger when they were at the polling center, where they were actually voting? I think that feeds into some of the points I'll try to make today. But this idea of building trust in the system is clearly something we all need to focus on. I think as we all study the decline of democracy and the many ways that autocrats are learning from one another, IFES has had a series on this. I personally am seeing attack on the judiciary as a current area of intense interest, not just in the United States, but globally. I think it's new that it's so intense in the United States. We often consider at IFES 3 ways that the integrity of elections can be compromised. The first, we say is fraud, which is somebody intentionally trying to change the electoral results. This could be ballot stuffing or padding election results, et cetera. Another I would call misfeasance, many academics call it malpractice, is just really mistakes that are made, lack of training, lack of financing, et cetera, that could change the outcome of an election. But the last issue, and one that I think is more prevalent these days, is systemic manipulation. And by that, I mean that somebody is trying to rig the system, change the law, change the policies, the procedures to ensure that one party has an advantage or could win. Today, my focus will be on systemic manipulation, which I believe for those trying to influence elections is the cleanest. You can look like you're doing things appropriately through legal reform. And it also has the best return on investment. It's much cheaper to write a law and have it implemented than it is to try to stuff ballots across the country. So I think systemic manipulation is where we really are at the battlefront these days. And strategic litigation, which I will discuss, is at the center of this right now. You can use strategic litigation, as we've seen, to shape the rules of the game and building on the previous presentations, to erode trust in the electoral process, which may be the first issue that people are trying to do. I will focus on the US today, but clearly we see this trend globally. And at the very end, I'll hit on a couple of those countries where we're seeing this happening. But over the last 2 decades, US elections have increasingly become arenas for strategic litigation. Lawsuits intended not merely to resolve legal questions, but to shape campaigns, to raise money, a lot of money, to influence public perceptions, and sometimes to decide outcomes of elections. I'll walk through, I think, where this really became prevalent from Bush v. Gore in 2000 to the turbulent 2024 election cycle. I would suggest that the use of strategic litigation became so prominent after Bush v. Gore in 2000. With Florida's recount hanging in the balance, I think as you all know, the US Supreme Court intervened December 12, 2000, and they halted a manual recount based on the Equal Protection Clause and effectively decided the presidential election. It was a watershed moment demonstrating how courts could directly determine or be part of an election results process. More importantly, it signaled the rise of election law as a specialty. There have always been law firms and lawyers working on election law, but after 2000, the number of lawyers and law firms and professors focusing on this area really exploded. Following 2000, strategic litigation infiltrated all areas of election results or election processes. One area that we've seen litigated continuously is redistricting cases. I'd like to point out, first and foremost, Veith of 2004, Pennsylvania case in which the Supreme Court held that partisan gerrymandering cases are non-justiciable. And that's due to the lack of a clear discernible standard. So therefore, the Supreme Court would not be hearing gerrymandering cases. This has been litigated at the state Supreme Court level, and they're starting to get some traction there, but there will not be a federal standard to apply to gerrymandering, which clearly in the United States is one of the biggest systemic manipulation issues we face. And then, you can't really talk about strategic litigation without pointing out Citizens United versus the FEC in 2010, which transformed campaign finance laws in the United States, opening the floodgates for super PACs and dark money. Just to put it in perspective, by 2004, outside spending ballooned over $4 billion in the 2024 election cycle. This litigation that came out versus Citizens United halted a trend at the time that was focused on more, not less, campaign finance regulations. But now that's all been thrown out the window. So you could see just how important strategic litigation could be. And this decision showed how litigation could sway more than just ballots. It could shape the political infrastructure itself, which has become the point of much of the litigation that we're seeing. Now, 2020 was also another turning point in strategic litigation. I think, as you all know, Republicans filed more than 60 lawsuits following the claims of voter fraud in 2020, and nearly all of those claims failed. I think all of them did, actually. There was a Stanford MIT post-election report that counted 82 lawsuits from election day through January 6th. And despite despite there being no evidence of systemic fraud, these cases showed widespread doubt and ended up in January 6th, which was very much part of this process to erode trust in the process, building on what Leah was talking about earlier. But this is part of a concerted effort, litigation, to try to undermine confidence in the election process, I would argue. By 2022, strategic litigation wasn't just a reactive thing, it has become a preemptive tool. In 2024, a Democracy Docket reported that over 300 voting rights lawsuits had been filed. That was more than double in 2020. The Republican National Committee filed us and supported over 80 suits before Election Day, targeting absentee ballot, voter rolls, and ID rules in battleground states. Democrats also and civil rights groups countered with their own, challenging restrictive laws, seeking to preserve ballot access, voter ID, etc. And as AP News and Barron's reported at the time, the legal chess game filed by both parties was driven less by legal merit and more by messaging, fundraising, and undermining vote confidence. And after 2020, the litigation effort has shifted. And as you all know, there's a real focus now on the modern battleground states, Michigan, Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, et cetera. And that will continue into the future. There will be more litigation, not less. The good news, after all of this negativity, is that courts fortunately remain cautious. Even with hundreds of cases filed for changes in mail-in ballot, voter ID, and even the certification deadlines, in the United States, the legal bar for overturning results remains extremely high. One thing that I think is very interesting in the United States is our standing requirements. I won't go into the specifics, but the high level of the level of standing that you need to be successful in filing a complaint in the United States is very high, and this helps reduce the number of cases that move beyond the initial filing. In many countries we work, that's not the case. And in 2023, the decision of Moore versus Harper reaffirmed the role of the judiciary in election cases, meaning the court confirmed that the judiciary has the ability and the right to review election laws, claims, and processes, rejecting the independent state legislature theory, which is a theory that the courts couldn't intervene at all. That was overturned, thankfully. So why does all this matter? I think since 2000, the legalization of politics has become prevalent, and lawsuits are a weapon of persuasion now. It mobilizes donors, it energizes voters by claiming that they're defending democracy. It ties up election officials, forcing them to dedicate resources to the courts, and it spreads doubt. If elections are contentious in court, legitimacy erodes, even if ultimately those cases are unsuccessful. Yet courts still keep boundaries. Cases to actually overturn or delay certification remain rare. Judges across the spectrum dismissing frivolous claims confirms that elections are decided by voters, not courts, thankfully. But despite all of this, strategic litigation is now entrenched. Both parties and even non-party groups are investing heavily in legal operations, embedding them within campaign structures. The 2024 cycle saw more pre-election lawsuits than ever. As I mentioned before, 300 were filed by mid-cycle in 2024, and 80 specifically by the RNC. But courts will continue to enforce high legal standards. They will try to turn away frivolous challenges, and they'll safeguard election administration. So in most cases, the courts are holding strong, but will that continue to be the case? I do think strategic litigation has transformed US elections from occasional disputes into a standard election campaign tool. It can secure meaningful reforms. Litigation is not always bad. It can confront gerrymandering. It can uphold voting rights. It can look towards campaign finance reform, but it also can undermine democratic norms and trust in the process. Going forward, I think it's essential for us to preserve robust but responsible legal scrutiny to these cases, protecting against fraud and ensuring access to the ballot for voters, while avoiding the weaponization of courts to undermine confidence. Internationally, we've seen that this trend is actually taking root as well. Most recently in Mexico, we did see the reform that made all of the judges in Mexico elected for the first time. And this reform was put in place while the party in power knew they would win the majority of the judicial elections in Mexico. Kenya, as you know, the intervention of the courts was integral to the 2017 annulment case and the 2022 confirmation case, which was very much in line with Kenya holding strong in 2022 against strategic litigation trying to overturn election results again. And then Romania, most recently, the annulment that took place in 2024. There are more cases that I can mention, but the trend is so clear. Strategic litigation is increasingly becoming used as a political tool. I think the question for all of us is how do we monitor, engage with this process and manage the trend? Through Bush v. Gore, the 2020 lawsuits, and the record-breaking litigation in 2024, we've seen both the promise and the perils of election law being manipulated. If we are to maintain trust in our democracy, we must channel strategic litigation towards transparency and justice, not just doubt and division. So with that, I look forward to your questions. I didn't have a PowerPoint, mine was a bit short, but I do look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Chad. I think that was just terrific. I've been asked to make a few comments, I think, relative to the presentations here. And in the meantime, I see that people are already posting questions in the comments. So if you have questions for any of our panelists, please place them in the chat of the Zoom call here. I just want to make a couple brief comments that occurred to me as I was listening to these presentations, and that is that we don't have a perfect system. One of my favorite lines from the Federalist Papers is James Madison saying to the critics of the Constitution, well, a faultless plan was not to be expected. And you can't create a faultless system. And especially in an electoral system, I think you've got at least 4 factors that are working against you. One, democracy doesn't scale well. So the idea of trying to do a democracy on this scale is an intrinsically difficult task. It's supposed to be a small scale enterprise. That was one of the big debates around the founding, around the writing of the Constitution. And I think that we're seeing some of the problems with scaling that are taking place right now. A second reason for the complexity of our, the imperfection of our system is just how complex it is. I think, and Leah especially, I think, made this clear in her presentation. You know, I think if you think about all the goods that you're trying to accomplish in an election, it seems to me that there are at least 9 different kinds of goods that you're trying to maintain. And they're often contradictory with each other. So you want your elections to be accurate. You want them to cost a reasonable amount of money. You want them to be fair to all the parties involved. You want rapid, indeed instant results in your elections. You want complete transparency in your elections. You want there to be a reasonable review and recount process in place. You want them to be safe in the sense that people are not coerced by either public or private actors into their vote. And coercion can take all kinds of different forms, right? Really hard forms of coercion, but also soft forms of coercion as well. You want them to be private, right? So that each voter's vote maintains its privacy. You want the system to be as inclusive as possible. But while making it inclusive, you want each individual vote to retain its value. And I would suggest that there's just no way you can get all those things. Or to get all those things, you're going to have to accommodate and make adjustments to some to get others. And for the most part, I think we can live with that kind of imperfection until elections get really close. I think Bush v. Gore is a really interesting example of that. Like, what happens when you start falling within the margin of error? Then things get really complicated. When you have large margins, I think the imperfections are less visible. The third complicating factors, I think all three of our panelists brought this up, is how the Federalist system affects our transparency, knowledge about the voting process, confidence in the voting process. And I think that there's all kinds of interesting aspects to that. I think about Bush v. Gore quite a bit in this regard. Like, what would have happened if we had had not a Federalist system in place, but a national system in place, and now you have a national recount occurring instead of just locating the recount in Florida the way our system did. And then finally, I think there's a kind of meta problem here that all three speakers touched on as well. And that is, in any kind of political system, especially when you're trying to scale democracy the way we are, what kind of operative principle of neutrality do you have in place? And in face-to-face interactions, we're not particularly concerned with principles of neutrality because we're kind of hashing things out in an adversarial fashion. But when you're scaling things, you really need to have some kind of principle of neutrality in place. And that becomes extraordinarily difficult when you have non-neutral figures both making the rules and implementing the rules. And I thought Sarah's presentation really touched nicely upon some of the challenges you face in those kinds of situations. So those are just some general comments that I have. And I see that we have, I don't know if anybody kind of wants to quickly respond to that. Otherwise, we can turn to the questions from our audience.
Jeff, just one quick jump in on that. I think it was interesting on the Bush v. Gore issue that you brought up. I agree. First of all, I think the idea that democracy doesn't scale is such an important point. I'm really happy that you raised that. It's really interesting to think about it. I do think on Bush v. Gore, and you said, would we have to have a national recount? When you combine that to your other comment about a large margin, actually kind of solves a lot of these problems. And you're absolutely right. No election is perfect. And that's what made the Kenya 2017 decision so problematic, was because it said because they couldn't prove the election was perfect, they were going to overturn the results. Imagine if that was the way it was. But in Bush v. Gore, you got to remember, if it was a national election, Gore won by 543,000 votes. So that there wouldn't have been a national recount because it would have been close. So the Federalist system and the Electoral College actually created that system. I'm not saying that close to 527 votes that made that decision was in Florida, not the national level, where Gore won nationally by over 500,000 votes.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to do the math here a second. That'd be 1/2 of 1% or something like that.
Yeah, it was 48.4% to 47.9.
Yeah, so I don't know if you did a national recount, what kind of percentage would trigger an automatic recount?
Yeah, because it's usually 0.5%. Yeah.
Okay.